Things I like to do, and I've done this for a long time, is when it's a clear night and I can be outside, I stand there in the driveway and I look up at the stars and I marvel at what seems like just so many you can't count them. And many of those stars generate their own light because they're true stars. And then there are others, though, that reflect light from other sources. Now, a few months ago, Venus and Jupiter were aligned in proximity. They were just right over top of each other, and they were in the western sky every night. They were so easy to find. But then, of course, there's our moon, and then there's others that can be seen. But they have no light of their own. They reflect the light from the sun to our area of observance. Now, our light as Christians is similar to that. We should reflect the light. And that's going to be our study tonight as we're looking at shining as lights in the world. So if you turn to Philippians chapter 2, we're going to take a look at these verses here, verses 12 through 16, get the context here before we begin talking about a few things that are found here and the one verse that is really our focus. That'd be verse 15. Starting in Philippians chapter 2 and in verse 12, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without murmuring and disputing, that you may be blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain, shining as lights in the world." If you look at other translations of the Bible, a multitude of them, you'll see that lights in the world is translated differently in a lot of places. One of them has lights in the sky. That sounds pretty good. Another has stars in the sky. And the one I think I like best of all is stars in the universe, because when we look up, that's what we see, and I think that's what it's reflecting here for us, the light that's reflecting from those stars in the universe. And when we look at this and we see that there's lights, and as I said, the light that we have and we're supposed to be showing is we shine as lights in the world like stars in the universe, so we reflect light. We don't really have light ourselves. We don't generate the light ourselves. We're supposed to be reflecting the light. So the first thing that we need to do is to be able to identify the light. And in order to do that, we need to go back to a character that's the forerunner of Jesus, and that would be John the Baptist. So turn to the book of John, chapter 1, and we're going to take a look at a few verses here. Now, in the very beginning here, John and things that were going on, and there's some identification that goes on with everything there in John chapter 1. But John himself says that he bore witness of the light. And so when you read verses 6 through 13, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man who comes into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Now, further evidence in the chapter and also in more of the book of John, and pretty soon you've got the idea here. You find out that the evidence reveals the light to be Jesus. And Jesus, by his own testimony, says that he is the light of the world. And we're familiar with that. That's found, directly stating, that's found in 3 places in the book of John. John chapter 8, and in verse 12 is the first one there, where Jesus spoke to them and said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And then in John chapter 9 and verse 5, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And one more time in John chapter 12 and verse 46, I have come as a light into the world, that whoever believes in me should not abide in darkness. Now, one of the things you learn about this, and then another place that we're going to look at here, is that light and darkness are both in the world. In John chapter 3, verses 19 through 21, Jesus says, this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. Now, what we learn here is that there's light and darkness both in the world. And one of the things that light does, it dispels darkness. The darkness is there in the house late at night when you come home. You walk in, you flip the light switch, the light comes on, it dispels the darkness. If you're in, they used to do this when they had cave tours, years ago. They'd shut the lights off. Everybody would be in there in the dark, total darkness. And then they would, they would strike a match back then. I don't know if you can do that now, or a lighter or something like that. There'd just be just that little bit of light that would show up in all of that darkness. And it just looked as big as a searchlight in darkness like that. Light dispels darkness. Jesus has come here to dispel darkness, to make the darkness recede, and to have people to come out of the darkness and into the light. Most of us would have no qualm whatsoever about walking out of darkness into light. But then when you're going to walk out of light into darkness, well, that's a whole horse of a different color, you might say. And you're not so eager to do that. But we can understand how this all works. And since men love evil and consequently hate the light, we're told here. But another thing that we find in the readings that we had there, that deeds or works can clearly be identified. It's not that hard to do. And sometimes people are watching, and they're watching you, and they may not know that you're a Christian. They may not know that you're a member of the church. They may have all these false concepts of what the church is or what they think that it should be. They don't have any real understanding of what the truth and what the facts are about that. But they can look at somebody and observe them, and they can tell if they do things right or wrong. And they can make observances and make decisions along that line. And you'd be surprised sometimes when those things happen and what the reaction is. And a lot of times you'll never know what's going through their mind as they might observe you. When they see you do some act of kindness or whatever the case might be. But they do see it and they do recognize that. Deeds and works can be clearly identified. Now the condition is described for us there in our text. And I always think when I look at this about shining as lights in the world, and I think about the world round about us, and Andrew spoke about that last night and did a good job. But the world round about us it's in a pitiful shape. And I've lived long enough that I'm able to say I don't know when it hasn't been in a pitiful shape. I think nowadays that information flies around so fast, we just hear about it faster and more often than we used to, and then we think that it's worse. But I don't know about that. I don't have data on that to be able to tell if things are worse now than they ever were. You hear that a lot from folks. But I do know there's one place back in the Old Testament where it says that the intent and thoughts of the heart were on evil continually. That's back in the days of Noah, many centuries ago. And, the thoughts and intents of the heart on evil, well, we understand that. And we'd say, oh, yeah, there's a lot of that going on today. And indeed there is. But the thing that we need to remember is that it also says continually. It means that there were people there, and it seems to me that there was apparently a lot of them. That's all they had on their mind, all the time. And I don't know if it's that bad or not today, like it was back in the days of Noah. But certainly we do see similarities to that, and it gives us pause. I also think that if we go to New Testament times, we can go to the book of Romans and chapter 1. And there we'll find, now in the early part of the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul writes about the sins of the Gentiles, chapter 1. And then when he gets over to chapter 2, he begins talking about the sins of the Jews. And then that leads him up to his conclusion on chapters 1 and 2 in chapter 3. Jew or Gentile, all have sinned. And he's already said earlier that the gospel was for all, Jew or Gentile. So he talks about the solution, then he talks about the reason for needing this solution, and all have sinned. But when you talk about the Gentiles in comparison to the Jews, well, the Jews, they were this group of people that were basically living in a certain area and they'd always kind of been isolationists among themselves as far as that could be. At the time of the writing of the New Testament, there wasn't too much anymore. They'd invited people in to help them out with a problem, the Romans, and then the Romans stayed. They didn't much care for that, but that's where they were at. But when you talk about the Gentiles, that's everybody else. That's everybody in the world then that wasn't a Jew was a Gentile. Didn't matter where they're at. If they were in Macedonia, if they were in Asia, if they were in Egypt, all Gentiles. It's everybody else. So in Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 29, he says, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness, they are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, I lost my place there, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, that would be spiritual death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Yeah, well, that's contemporary to the New Testament, and that really does, again, sound a whole lot like it is today. So I think we've pretty well got a good grip when we talk about the world and equate that to the darkness that Jesus was talking about and the problems that we have today in the world and the darkness that's there, and the light really needs to shine. Now, when Jesus comes back, he's not coming back to shine his light. So shining the light now until he comes back is up to those who are Christians. We're to reflect that light. That's the task that lies before us. And when we think about this, now I got the New King James here, and it refers to this as a crooked and perverse generation in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15. So the meanings of this, I think, are somewhat interesting. First of all, there's the word crooked that's used here. Scolios, something that's bent, curved, or twisted. I went to school in junior high and senior high. They closed up an elementary school and moved everybody down to the big town in the county, which was 2,000 people. Ooh. And one of the children that was moved down there at the time, and was in my class actually, she wore a brace, and it was a brace that was, I don't know, it almost looked like she was in a cage. It went around her head and held her head still, and it had a thing here where her chin was all the time. She couldn't turn her head either way, or her head up or down, and then it went down into her shirt and finally ended up down here around her waist. That's why I say it kind of looked like a cave. You could see the imprint of it, in the back of her shirt when she'd sit there in a desk. And she had scoliosis. Well, we know what that means, don't we? Somebody's got scoliosis, has got what? Bent, curved, or twisted spine. That's where we get our word scoliosis from, this very word right here. Now, metaphorically, it refers to what deviates from the standard. And you go to Proverbs chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, that talks about being wicked and twisted and so on over there, and get an idea of the meaning. Also, we have here the word perverse, diastrepho, which means depraved. It's translated as depraved in the New American Standard Bible, twisted in the English Standard Bible. It's something that's distorted or corrupt. And in Acts chapter 2 and verse 40, the cry goes out, exhorting the people to obey the gospel, save yourselves from this perverse generation. Now that's what it says in the old translation. New translation has maybe untoward. There's different ways of putting that. Some even have wicked generation. But we understand what he was talking about. This is the solution for this, is to obey the gospel, as was pointed out that day, that you need to believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That was the whole subject of the sermon. Let's not get the idea that the sermon on the day of Pentecost was all about baptism. Baptism is mentioned in there, and so is repentance in there, and belief is in there. There were those that it says were cut to the heart, and I really think what that means is they'd heard what he had to say, and this had an effect on them to the point that they believed in this. They were cut to the heart. The message had its result, because the message is supposed to aim at the heart. Well, bullseye. It hit. And men cried out, "What shall we do?" And then they were told what to do, to repent and to be baptized. But what was the message that day? Sometime go back and look at it and just observe how the majority of that lesson was about Jesus and about him being crucified and raised from the dead. The message was all about Jesus. And the message of the gospel starts off all about Jesus. You take him away, you take away his death, burial, and resurrection, and the whole system collapses without that. Because that's the great proof that he's the Son of God. Read Romans chapter 1 and verse 4. But they were exhorted to save themselves by obeying the gospel from this perverted generation. The generation there is a word that simply means an age, a generation, a nation, or a time, any of those things. But he's talking here about being lights shining lights in a crooked and perverse generation. The solution is what we need to look at. The solution to this problem of the darkness and being in a perverted generation and shining as lights. How do we go about all this? What's some ideas? And one of the things that we should do when we're looking for ideas like that, we can look at the passages in the Bible, and a lot of times we'll find out the answers are right there in the context where we find Philippians 2:15. We read from chapter 2 from 12 to 16, and we get a lot of good points in there about what it takes to be effective as shining our light. We're supposed to be an influence. Now, all of us, I think, have probably heard very many times in lessons and other things along that line what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now here we go. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. He's saying there be an influence, and that's what salt does. It will influence food. Back in those days, it was used more than anything for a preservative. They didn't have all the chemicals and the processes that we do now, good or bad. But salt was a valuable preservative. And I'm sure that they also noticed not only did it preserve food, but like we do, it often makes things taste better, doesn't it? And doctors been after me for years telling me this, that, and the other. And they told me to lose weight, so I lost 45 pounds one time. Oh, your blood pressure will go down. Stayed the same. And they told me to exercise. Well, I mean to tell you, I hit the gym, I ran in the streets of town, and I did everything I could. Blood pressure stayed the same. And he told me to cut out salt. I thought he'd gone to meddling then, you know. And no, I can't. You just can't do that. It does make things taste better, doesn't it? Think about that. Salt on the right thing makes it go down better, makes it palatable. It influences your taste buds, is what it does. So be an influence. And not only does salt do that, but we find out that light is designed and intended to be seen. So we should reflect that light. See that in verse 15. And works are to be seen in verse 16 and the first part there. And then in the second part, we find out, well, now people will do what? They'll see your good works and they'll glorify you. No, they'll glorify your Father in heaven, because the light that shines from your doing these good works, you're reflecting, you see, the light of Jesus into others, and they'll see that and they'll glorify God on behalf of this. Maybe not at the very beginning, but if they pursue it, if they ask, that's what you should say. Why do you do the things that you do? I remember helping someone one time with some gas money. Anyway, I won't go through the details. I didn't always do that, but this time I did. And I was telling someone, I helped somebody with some gas earlier in the week. Why did you do that? This is another Christian asked me, why'd you do that? I said, well, you know how we say that the church can't help somebody like that? Now, they called the church phone. Church can't help somebody like that, and that individuals are supposed to do it? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I think individuals should do it. And I'm an individual, and I thought I ought to do it. And I wasn't any fanfare about it. You know, I'm doing something like that. And a lot of times you don't hear from people. They don't call you back again. They'll tell you some reason for needing it. And this lady, when her need was met, she got to where she needed to be. And she called me back. I was surprised. She said, show me your name. Said, do you remember me? No. And she told me that I'd given her the gas and one thing and another. And she said, we made it to the hospital in Columbus, I think it was, and had a little girl. And I thought, that's just great. But we're supposed to do things as individuals. And I wonder sometimes if we do that, or is that just a cop-out and we do nothing? I don't know. But I know we should do it. Maybe we shouldn't do it all the time, but we should do it sometimes, shouldn't we? We can be an influence on things. We can actually make a difference. Now, how do you do this and make a difference? Well, I said a few moments ago, you go back to Philippians chapter 2, and let's go there. Now, we're going to look at several things that are found in the context there between verses 12 and 16. The first thing it says here, and while Paul's writing this, he's actually referring to the teachings of Christ. The first thing I want you to look at here is that he says, work out your own salvation. Now, you think about that just a little bit. I don't know. I know there's a lot of passages in the Bible that are twisted up to say something that they don't mean. And people look at this and, well, they'll tell somebody that's not a Christian out there in the world, floating around somewhere, doing whatever and so on, and they'll tell them, work out your own salvations. Now, I know that that's what people do out here in the denominational world. That's what they tell folks. But sometimes you find those that are Christians telling people, well, work out your own salvation. This wasn't written to people out in the world. It was written to the church at Philippi. This was something that was written to Christians and telling Christians to work out your own salvation. Now you think about that for just a little bit and what all that means. It's not find some way to do it. It's more like you've got the directions. We've got the directions, don't we? We've got the directions on how to become a Christian and how to live as a Christian. We've got the directions. Do it. Work out your own salvation. Conduct yourself as a Christian. Philippians 1:27 says that our conduct ought to be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then he talks about fear and trembling. Now, I like to look at James chapter 4 on this and verse 10. James chapter 4, verse 10. It says there, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Your fear and trembling, can you not see the idea there of humbling yourself before the Lord? And do this without complaining and disputing. Or you might say murmuring or muttering. That's Mr. Thayer. I got a kick out of what he said, in low tones. Every once in a while, Martha will tell me something or refer to something, and you know what I do when I hear that? I begin muttering and speaking in low tones. She'll ask me, what are you mumbling about? Nothing. You know what I'm talking about there, don't you? That's complaining. Yeah, that's what he's talking about. Or questioning critically. Let's not be questioning critically. We've got the word. Here's what it is. And that's what we should be doing. You can look at James chapter 1, verse 22 through 25 on that. Then he also says to be blameless and harmless. We're familiar with the passage in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, I'm sure, where it says to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. No guile, no deception. It's unadulterated. It's simple. It's honest. It's forthright. That's how Jesus was. That's how we should be as well. And then finally, we are to hold fast or hold forth, depending on your translation, the word of life. What does it say over there in Colossians chapter 3? A lot of times we know about Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16, but verse 17 comes right after that, and it says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So we hold forth and hold fast, and when we've got the opportunity to reflect the light in us, we ought to be thankful for the opportunity to do that, the privilege to be able to do that, and do it without hesitation, without the mumbling and the grumbling and other things along that line. But one of the things that we need to do, and as I sum up here, we just need to do it. There's where the solution is at. You want to make a difference in a crooked and perverse generation, age, world, whatever? You want to make a difference? Just do what the Bible says needs to be done. And you'll make a huge difference, perhaps bigger than you can imagine, if you'll just do it. We need to become a light that shines. We need to obey the gospel. That means initially and continually. And we need to be letting our light shine. And maybe take that light out from underneath the basket and let it shine. And you can make a difference by being a Christian first, and then living as a Christian second. I want to make one observation before the bell rings. I didn't think I'd get done before the bell rings. I'm as surprised as anybody. But anyway, that's the lesson. And I hope that it's been beneficial to you. I know it's beneficial to me thinking about these things and putting it all together. It's not hard to do. It very seldom is. But the problem is it gets left undone. And that's the real tragedy, when we could actually do more. But we choose not to do more. Not that we're forced to do more. Circumstances are this, that, and the other. Oh yeah, I understand. But still, maybe sometimes we let the circumstances get a hold of the situation and control our actions easier than they should. But we can do it. And I'm convinced that we can do it because whatever's in the Bible, we're told in 1 John chapter 5, the commandments of the Lord, they're not burdensome. Other translations have, they're not grievous. I take that to mean they're not hard to do. They're not impossible at all. We can do it if we just put our mind to it. All right, well, they told me when I started out preaching, stand up, speak up, and shut up. So I'm going to shut up here. You've been very kind and very attentive, and I really appreciate it.